Good evening and welcome. My name is Chase Rind. I'm the Executive Director here at the National Building Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. On behalf of our staff and our Board of Trustees, I welcome you to the museum on this very special occasion, the presentation of the 11th Annual Vincent Scully Prize to Christopher Alexander, architect, author, educator, and a founder of the Center for Environmental Structure. The museum is delighted that two former Scully Prize laureates have joined tonight's ceremony. Witold Rybczynski, noted author and professor of urbanism and real estate at the University of Pennsylvania, received the Scully Prize in 2007 for his work as a scholar, author, and professor, and for his exploration of American urbanism. And Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who together with her partner, Andres Duany, received the prize in 2004. Liz is a founding principal of the Miami-based firm Duany Plater-Zyberk and dean of the University of Miami School of Architecture. She also serves on the Scully Prize jury. I would like to recognize other jury members that made the selection to honor Christopher Alexander. Ned Kramer, editor-in-chief of Architect magazine, architect and fellow museum board member Deborah Burke, and Robert Peck, who was recently appointed Commissioner of Public Buildings for the U.S. General Services Administration. And finally, I do need to acknowledge Scott Kratz, our Vice President for Education, who has worked so closely with the jury in organizing this prize. I commend the jury for their inspired choice of tonight's honoree. For nearly 40 years, Christopher Alexander has challenged the architectural establishment to pay more attention to the human element of design, and his work continues to influence innovators around the world. The Vincent Scully Prize was established in 1999 under the leadership of David Schwarz, nationally renowned architect and chair of the Scully Prize jury. The prize recognizes exemplary practice, scholarship, or criticism in architecture, landscape architecture, historic preservation, or urban design. It is with David's vision and the vision of the entire Scully jury that the prize has become one of the most significant awards in the architecture and design fields. Please join me in welcoming David Schwarz to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been doing this, is my 11th year of doing this, so for those of you who have been here before, I'm sure that in some way I'll repeat myself. Chase has said a great deal of what I was going to say in talking about when the prize was first came about and some of Mr. Alexander's reasons for being selected. But I do want to talk briefly about the prize itself and why it is important and why it is important to me and why it should be important to all of us. One of the interesting things about architecture is and urban design and the built environment is it's a product we all use on a daily basis. Yet it's a product that we don't talk about very much. I was once designing a secondary school, and the director of the selection committee said, excuse me, during my interview, why should we hire you and pay you a lot of money rather than to give more money for scholarships? My response was, when you drove out here to conduct this interview, what did you pass? And they all described their drive, and I said, did you think it was pretty? And they all went and talked about how ugly the environment was between their homes and the school. And I asked them then at what age did they think it was appropriate to start educating their children about design. We won. They got a nice building. They concluded that the time to ask their children to start learning about design was then. And I would say likewise that the time that we all need to start talking about design is now, in every moment. This is a particularly interesting period of design design and the built environment, because I think there's a great deal of dialogue and discussion about how we ought to live and how we ought to build. One of the reasons that we chose Mr. Alexander, Professor Alexander, was he in many ways really does round out many of our Scully awardees. And as we choose the people, we are very concerned with the diversity of people that the prize honors and the diversity of thought and opinion that is expressed in terms of the built environment. Past award winners have included Andres and Liz, as Chase talked about, who really have brought a very unique view of a practitioner writer to talking about how we should build our cities. We had the Aga Khan and Prince Charles, who have been real advocates for good design in very different ways. We've tried to be very multicultural in our look at how we approach the built environment. We don't think it's simply a Western question, but a worldwide question. And one of the reasons this is so important is because the West is a model for development, and I think we owe it to the rest of the world to discuss how to develop, because so many people do look to us. In a lot of ways, Professor Alexander also follows in that some of our awardees have been practitioners. For example, Bob Stern, and again, Andres and Bob Venturi. And I think one of the interesting things is to look at both practitioners who both practice and think. It is very important to look at theory and figure out how to apply that theory to the built environment. There have been a lot of non-practitioners as well. We don't want this to be an award for practitioners. One of the things that's so interesting about Professor Alexander is the fact that he has been a professor for almost 40 years. He's been extremely instrumental in developing how a 40 years worth of students think. He's written extensively, hundreds of articles and books. Some of his books have been really seminal in how we think about architecture today. For example, A Pattern Language and Towns, Buildings, and Construction. He really has changed the way a couple of generations have looked at the built environment and had a very profound impact on the discussion that people have about the built environment. The point of this prize is to recognize people who cause conversation and who cause people to change the nature of conversation, because it's only through discussion of the built environment that we'll build the world we want to live in. It is only through involved citizenry and educated citizenry that we are going to build a better place to be. It's very interesting to me to note how public opinion has really changed the attitude towards environmental responsibility in the world at large today. I can remember 10 years ago, if you asked a developer whether they were interested in producing a green building, they would laugh at you. Now they come and they tell you they need to build green buildings. They don't necessarily need to build green buildings because they think it's the right thing to do. They think it's something that the public will demand. And I think that really speaks very largely to how the impact of people like you and the world at large can really change how we think about the built environment and how we build what we build, as well as what we build. So it is with a great deal of pleasure that we give the award to Mr. Alexander today. We are up until a week ago, we thought he was coming. Unhappily, we gave it to him a year too late in his life because his health has suffered a setback, so he won't be joining us this evening. But he really does deserve this recognition. I'm very happy we were able to give it to him and that he can see a video of this evening's proceedings so he can feel appropriately warmly about your reception of him. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now you can see why the museum so values David's leadership on this prize. He's bringing together for us, for all of us, some great names and great ideas. The namesake for the prize, Vincent Scully, was not able to join us this evening, but he did ask me to read a few words on his behalf. Vince writes, and I quote, "Christopher Alexander has been a major pioneer in the revival of a humane architecture and urbanism that has been taking place over the past 40 years. During the 60s and 70s, when most architects were preoccupied with individual buildings, Alexander was concerned with the patterns of the man-made environment as a whole and with their relation to the natural world. In his most influential of many books, A Pattern Language of 1977, he tells us that he is dealing first with towns and only then with individual buildings. And he says that each of them should help, quote, repair the world around it, so taking its place in what he calls the web of nature. It is a message of healing, and as a gentle herald of the new contextual and ecological codes of contemporary urban practice, it puts us in Alexander's debt today." And with those words, Vince Scully aptly describes the immense contribution Mr. Alexander has made to the world of architecture and contemporary urban planning. Now, as David just mentioned, sadly, Christopher was unable to join us this evening and could not travel from his home in London. We are, though, very fortunate to have assembled a panel of Christopher's colleagues and leading experts in the design field who will be sharing their thoughts about how Christopher's work has impacted the profession. And we are filming tonight's event so that we can share this special program with Christopher. We are joined this evening by Michael Mahaffey, former Director of Education, Prince's Charitable Trust, a research associate at the Center for Environmental Structure, and noted international lecturer and author on architecture, planning, philosophy, semiotics, and the work of Christopher Alexander. Michael will be providing a brief overview of Christopher's contribution to the field, and he will be followed by Randy Schmidt, who will read a personal note from Christopher. Randy is an architect and an engineer who has worked with Chris for more than 25 years. He is vice president of the Center for Environmental Structure, and he is the project manager for CES design, building, and construction projects. Following their presentations, we will be joined by a distinguished panel, including Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, Michael Mahaffey, and Witold Rybczynski, moderated by Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic for the Boston Globe, Robert Campbell. Please welcome Michael Mahaffey.
Thanks very much, Chase. And Chris is here in spirit with us tonight. What we're going to do is Randy's going to read a statement from Chris, and very interestingly is going to introduce some new work. So I told Chris, joking, you don't have to do new work for this award. They're going to give it to you anyway. But be that as it may, we're going to describe a little bit, a direct message from Chris, and carry on perhaps at a later venue if Chris can join us perhaps in 6 months or so. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to anyone here tonight when I observe that in the last century, we humans have begun to make a very worrisome mess of our planet. I think those of us in this room are aware of that. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the ways that we've chosen to build our world. And for many people, there's a growing perception that the manifest sustainability of this state of affairs is in some perhaps deep and important way connected to the growing ugliness of the world that we're building. So I think one reason that Christopher Alexander's work strikes such a strong chord, emotional chord for so many people, is that he took up this challenge a long time ago, and he offered a very humane vision of a more hopeful alternative. He reminded us of the beautiful and harmonious places that we are capable of achieving and have achieved, and he offered some ideas about how to achieve them again in a way that's likely to be much more sustainable and more beautiful. And interestingly, the evolutionary biologists are beginning to confirm that the beauty of sustainable ecosystems is not an accident and does have a relationship to the kind of structure that they have. So there's starting to be some broader scientific evidence to support this link between what is sustainable and what is beautiful. Many of you may know that Chris started as a mathematician and a physicist and only then went into architecture, which he does see as very much related. But that fact surprises a number of people who seem to think of Chris as a kind of California poet of the built environment, a romantic and even a quixotic figure. But let me suggest to you that things are much more interesting than that. There's a great story about how Chris, as a precocious 16-year-old, went to Cambridge and won his scholarship. He and the other finalists were in their last examination replicating a famous physics experiment using very sensitive laboratory equipment, and Chris kept getting the wrong result. He was really frustrated. He turned in his incomplete work, dejected, and went home convinced that he had lost this wonderful opportunity. And so he was astonished when a few weeks later he actually was awarded the scholarship. It turns out that there was a very strong electromagnet that was skewing the results and giving a slightly distorted reading. And the other candidates who knew the theory were adjusting their results ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly, to fit the theory. And Chris alone was stubbornly sticking with what he saw. And he won the scholarship on that basis. And ever since then, Chris has said that he's made a commitment to never, ever let his own or anyone else's preconceptions color what he himself found to be true in his own raw encounter with the world. That had to be the place where everything had its firmly anchored roots. Now, this has made Chris a rather obstinate character at times, as he himself will tell us. He's certainly been frank in speaking out about the sorts of modern architectural mistakes that we all lament and the self-rationalizing ideologies that have perpetuated them. And he's certainly not tried very hard to go along with prevailing institutional mindsets or diplomatic politics. His laser-like focus has really been elsewhere. But this has really been the price to be paid, I think, to do the work that he's done and the evident benefits that have come out of it. And that willingness to follow the path of what he's found to wherever it has led him has taken him in undeniably surprising new directions at times, directions that have surprised him perhaps as much as anyone else. But let me assert that he has, in fact, been on a continuous path from the beginning, and we can see that very clearly if we look at his career. And that's not to say that everything that Chris has come up with along the way is true any more than for any other investigator. In fact, Chris himself will tell us that some of it isn't true. In fact, I don't know of many authors who will use the 10th anniversary of their own highly influential book, as Chris did with Notes on the Synthesis of Form, to say, you know, you really shouldn't believe all the stuff that's in this book. I'm on to some other stuff now. But what I think has to be conceded is that the fellow has come up with some remarkably useful stuff going far beyond the perennial popularity of the books. And I'll start just by giving you some mundane examples. I bet a lot of people have iPhones in this room, and what do you know? You have Chris Alexander technology in your pockets. The structure of pattern languages is embodied in its operating system and in the language of the apps that it uses, along with the Macintosh, the Mac system, and many other computer systems. And probably many of us have used wikis in the last couple of weeks. That too was inspired by Chris's work, as Ward Cunningham, the inventor of Wiki, confirmed to me in an interview a few months ago. Or if you've used a computer game like SimCity or many other games and much other software, you've used pattern languages. I was involved in a symposium last week with Ward and some others to see where pattern languages are going, and it was really fascinating to hear and to see some of what's going on, not just in computers, but in a lot of other fields. Today you can find in the published literature, and I'm just going to scroll through these very briefly, pattern languages for human-computer interface, for collaborative work, for conservation economies, for environmental research, for innovative management and research, for strategic project management, for weddings, I love that one, and a number of other things. And for those who think there's not really rigorous science involved here, there are, in fact, pattern languages for amino and nucleic acid sequences. And what I think must be one of the most fascinating examples, a new paper, a recent paper, on pattern languages for multicellular organisms, the evolution of multicellular organisms from the Precambrian explosion to the organisms like us. Pretty fantastic, mind-blowing stuff. And there are hundreds more. I love this one, a pattern language for provisioning and managing quality-constrained services in distributed real-time and embedded systems. Somebody else will have to explain to you what that one is. And this all came from a bloody architect, and that mystical Bay Area guy, no less. So clearly there's some useful stuff coming out of this guy's work. And as I noted, this goes back to Chris's early and very rigorous work documented in the book Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which is upstairs, by the way, and in the paper, which many of you may know, A City is Not a Tree, his effort to tease apart the secrets of complexity, along with others of that time like Herbert Simon, and in planning the wonderful Jane Jacobs. And Chris never left that pursuit of the relationship of parts to wholes, that wonderful word you may not know, but it's fallen into disuse, Mariology, the uniting theme of his work from the beginning, right up through the rather mind-blowing conclusions in the new work, The Nature of Order. How does nature create patterns of complexity, beauty, and sustainability? What can we learn from that process? What are our own technological systems doing wrong that we can make them more robust in that way? And that goes right back to that lab in Cambridge. And this has always been grounded in real confrontations with observable human phenomena, in projects, in systems, in social contexts, and in real human lives. And this is one important reason that Chris has never gotten lost in the abstractions, never let his theories or his artistic interest leave the real human realm, the real quality of people's lives and their relation to their ecology. And for him, this was surely the overriding responsibility of the architectural profession. And the architectural applications are continuing to develop and have recently shown their own form of surging innovation, thanks to Chris's own recent work in this area, which Randy, our colleague Randy Schmidt, will describe. And thanks to some of the folks who are Chris's students and colleagues and their collaborators. And there's an army of them out there applying pattern languages, updating and evolving and improving them, integrating the insights of his ambitious new book, The Nature of Order, and doing a lot of other pretty interesting things. Our good colleagues who are leaders of the Congress for the New Urbanism have been taking these insights forward for quite a long time, making very useful advances in how we might change the operating system of unsustainable sprawl development and begin to transform it into something more humane and more whole. Doug Farr, who is the co-developer of LEED-ND, and by the way, LEED is another very interesting way of changing the operating system, as I think was said earlier. Doug has based his fine new book, Sustainable Urbanism, on the pattern language structure as well. So there are a lot of people taking advantage of this, going forward, dealing with sustainability and social collaboration and the other great collaborations of our day, and inspired by our honoree's remarkable lifetime of work. And I know that's very, very gratifying to him. So while Chris has clearly accomplished some astonishing things in his own half-century of work, in many ways he's only opened doors for others to walk through and open up whole new topics. And I hope he will take some satisfaction in this growing army that's out there. Now, you notice that a lot of this work does come down to technology, and when you look at it, Chris's work is really very simply all about technology, not in the limited sense of mechanical industrialization of the last century or two, but technology as the more basic knowledge of how to relate parts to wholes, how to make things, how to make places, how to make them beautiful, and how to make them truly humane and truly sustainable, how to make them more alive in some important sense. We need to figure this out far better than we have, and in a sense what Chris has been stressing is that we have some ingredient missing in our technology today, something that is not as rich or as sustainable as what nature does and what life does on a routine basis, something that in principle certainly could be incorporated into our technology if we could simply understand better what we're doing. Because in a sense, what we have been doing is using a very formulaic, template-based kind of technology that is heavily reliant on standardization and replication. And we've been missing the power of adaptation and differentiation, which is what life does so phenomenally and so powerfully and so sustainably. And we can do it too, and in fact have done it in many ancient cultures. But in our current unsustainable model, we've lost the language for doing so, the poetic structure of the processes in our cultures that have made buildings and places come alive, as we see routinely from the best historical examples, and we see so rarely in new places today. In particular, Chris notes that the way we build today is still based too much on the standardized building rules, the abstracted building processes, and especially the abstracted game theory rules of debt and profit, and how they affect the various actors, a severe constraint in what Chris's student and colleague Howard Davis called the culture of building. Howard has a very fine book by that name, by the way. If we're going to get to a sustainable new model for the built environment, as we must, this is one of the crucial things that we must reform. So in his indefatigable, some would say even quixotic way, Chris has gone back to ask the most basic questions about all this, doing project-based research, asking how we might go about reforming these kinds of roles and processes, methods that might allow people to be able to work together more effectively, to grow something more beautiful, more living, more sustainable, more whole. And he's developed some ideas about generative sequences and generative codes, and also about how pattern languages might work in a broader and more communitarian form of collaborative building. Now, this might or might not result in a big breakthrough in architecture or in some unexpected application in other fields, and that's the risk that any investigator has to run. But if history is any guide, I'd like to suggest to you tonight that at the very least, this very interesting fellow is worth watching very, very closely, and if I may say so, cheering on. So on that note, I'm pleased to turn it over to our good colleague, Randy Schmidt, who will read out a message that Chris has prepared for this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and I'm very sorry that Chris could not be here, and I'm glad to have the chance to read a message to you from him. When the Scully Prize committee approached me with the news that they hoped I would accept the 2009 prize, I agreed and expected to provide them and the audience at the 2009 ceremony with a brief lecture that expressed a deep-seated and probing discussion of the nature of building form. It was my intention to make this discussion almost entirely visual, an essay governed by the content and character of the buildings I had built during the last 40 years. I have for years been selecting slides of my work with the purpose of drawing attention to the interior morphological character of those buildings that come closest, in my opinion, to my own aspirations as an architect. I now suspect, too, that these are similar to the aspirations of the Scully Prize itself. I've been thinking long and hard about the stated purpose of the Scully Prize, the goals of this prize, and the intentions that were set forth by Professor Scully himself. Whether I've hit the target in that regard, the future will perhaps let us know. But these intentions, as they are reflected in the human character of the slides, have now also come, in my mind, to be identified with my own aspirations during my working life as an architect. Unfortunately, tonight I'm not able to be with you in person due to the devastating case of pneumonia, which I have still not overcome. I very much regret missing the opportunity to speak with you directly. Instead, I have prepared a written summary of my lecture and have asked my colleague Randy Schmidt to read this summary to you. My fundamental proposition in the lecture is that our environment, our built world, must originate with the ideas and feelings and relationships that bring society to life. We need to construct our environment in such a way that the environment itself, its structure, its relationships, its internal configurations, must always derive from the living structure of society, of human action, the geometry of human configurations, and of our relationships to the land and to our own private and public personae. That means that the environment, viewed as a microcosm, must consist of many small relationships among things, and these highly personal relationships exist at a variety of scales. The environment will come to life for us if and only if it is built from generating relationships inherent in the acts of our daily lives. The more we are able to rehearse our social and psychological relationships and reinforce them, the more we will be comfortable, at ease, and whole within the fabric of all that we have made for ourselves. That is because it is, above all, a human endeavor. In contrast, the less well we succeed in fitting our environment to the small details of the social and human relationships of our society and culture, the more misfitted we shall be in our world, and the more unfortunate we shall continue to become. Logically, this is a very simple scheme. We need to assess and reckon up the human and physical relationships on which we thrive. Then we need to construct, realistically, the physical relationships which, when built into the fabric of our environment, will nourish our social and emotional lives. Each physical circumstance produces a different way of feeling and being. Each provides a direct and profound relationship between the physical configuration and the experience of feelings that are generated by it. In the most positive environments, the effect is that the physical configurations cause people to release their capacity for life in specific and spontaneous terms. For example, in order to simplify this idea, I shall refer to a number of configurations which can appear in our environment. In particular, I shall call these configurations which are most profound, most trenchant, the more archetypal configurations. They do the most work in making connections with human beings. Or in reverse, we may say that people make the most profound connections with those configurations where the connections are the most archetypal. At present, and at the time of this writing, I have identified about 20 of these archetypal configurations. Each of these configurations pulls on the emotions of the people who are living or taking part in the configurations. The physical configuration pulls out from the people who experience the place some complex of emotions, images, and archetypal forms. The words that follow are all similar, but they are not the same. They show how the mind activates itself in the context of the environment. As these examples will show, the environment activated by these configurations depends on certain kinds of words, such as engenders, begets, spawns, provokes, brings about, elicits, gives rise to, prompts, stirs, initiates, instigates, sets up, stimulates, produces, mobilizes, sparks, arouses, energizes. The elements which participate in any one of the 20 given configurations will pull forth from the emotions of the people who take part whatever total and holistic response which arises typically in that kind of archetypal configuration. These configurations, and in a more complete version of this paper that will be on the order of 250 discernible and different configurations, create a baseline of possible archetypes which mobilizes people's reactions, their visceral and psychological responses. I ask you now to look at about 250 pictures. You will see these pictures one after the other with short time intervals between them. The pictures will take 5 or 6 minutes to run. All the configurations describe ways in which the physical environment releases and activates our feelings. The pictures you will see are not the high-style photographs typically practiced and presented by architectural photographers. They are, rather, pictures caught on the wing, caught in the moment, where the content of the picture and its feeling are the all-important thing. These pictures demonstrate very simply the kinds of structure that support life. They show a morphology in our surroundings that supports humanity and allows it to thrive along with other inhabitants of this world. Life is never fixed, it's not perfect, but it is always recognizable, and it always shares a certain essence. I hope these pictures show a taste, a savor, an atmosphere that is the essence of living structure. It is always imperfect, just as it is, in part, perfect. These forms express life and come from life and encourage life in what is built next door to them. In some of the slides, you will see mock-ups and construction work going on. That is because the emphasis in all our works is on the making of things. We do not believe that a living environment can be created from drawings or from machine-like activities. Rather, the work and the beauty of the work, the inner feeling of the building, will come from a dedication to using a making process that engenders life. In every case shown here, the Center for Environmental Structure controlled the construction process as a process and could therefore maintain this emphasis directly. And I'll just let the slides play for a few minutes. Many of these pictures show archetypal configurations. Looking at these pictures does something to us inside, or being in the presence of the configuration touches us for reasons that are not entirely clear, yet are nonetheless powerful in the way they work on us. They touch our core. As we walk around the world, we find that certain buildings have a direct power to touch us, to involve us. Such configurations have a direct power to attach themselves to us. Our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings are mobilized by these configurations. We find ourselves bewitched, affected, moved. These are the spaces to which we gravitate. We come back to them again and again. This is similar to the experiences we have in nature. In a grove of trees on a hilltop, in a canyon, next to a broad river or a gentle valley, the shore of a quiet lake. The same feeling can come from a door which has wide frames or borders, a long table for 6 to 12 people, a niche where people sleep, a window seat, an avenue, a gate, a small tree which stands purposefully and collects people, gatherings, meetings, music through its configuration. For emphasis, I will show 2 of these pictures again. How many such places exist in the environments you know? It is rare, isn't it, to find such places? Yet it is the activity of making the environment with these archetypal qualities that gives depth to the places and what people feel there. I hope you can see the powerful role they play in our surroundings. These elements need to be brought out and used more carefully. I will attempt to be more precise about them in a more detailed follow-up piece to these remarks. My deepest wish is to support people's deep core by helping them to build bridges, public places that supports each person's strengths and elasticity with the intention of creating places that engender well-being. If we try our best to make all the places in our contemporary world with such vivid depth of feeling, surely then something will happen that changes our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
It's a typical performance of this kind in that the audience is totally invisible to us because all the lights are in our eyes. So if we don't pick out our friends, you can forgive us. My name is Robert Campbell. I was introduced earlier. I'm an architect. I write about architecture and have been involved with it for a long time. And it's my pleasure to introduce the 2 panelists who have not been introduced so far. At the far end, Witold Rybczynski. I did say that right, didn't I? Rybczynski. The Martin and Margie Meyerson Professor of Urbanism and Professor of Real Estate at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, and the architecture critic for the online magazine Slade. He is a scholar, author, professor, and architect. His diverse publications have explored the evolution of comfort, the history of the weekend. Did you do a lot of research for that? American urbanism and a search for the origins of the screwdriver, among other books. His book, Home, A Short History of an Idea, which I would recommend very highly, has been translated into 10 languages. His biography of landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, A Clearing in the Distance, received the J. Anthony Lucas Prize and other awards. And one of his latest books is Last Harvest, exploring, again, one that I would recommend, among others, the subject of American real estate development using case studies as examples. His essays appear regularly in the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic, the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He has also written for the New Yorker and Time. Witold was the 8th recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize. I feel like I'm probably introducing people who don't need to be introduced to you, but I've been asked to do it. Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, a founding principal of Dwani, Plater-Zyberk and Company, the leading new urbanist development and architectural and planning firm. She is Dean of the University of Miami's School of Architecture, where she has taught since 1979. Having initiated the graduate program in suburb and town design in 1988, Elizabeth continues to explore current issues in city growth and reconstruction with students and faculty. She is a multitasker, as I'm constantly noting. Served as director of the Center for Urban Community and Design, organizing and promoting numerous design exercises for the benefit of communities throughout South Florida. Founder and emeritus board member of the Congress for the New Urbanism, established in 1993, characterized by the New York Times as, quote, the most important phenomenon to emerge in American architecture in the post-Cold War era, end quote. She has co-authored 2 books, Suburban Nation, The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream, and The New Civic Art. Liz was the 3rd recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize, along with Andras Dwani, her partner. What we're going to do in the time remaining, I'm going to give a kind of little introduction about the impact of Christopher Alexander on my own life as a kind of personal view of what we've heard, more objective views maybe. And then I'm going to ask each of the 3 panelists to make whatever prefatory remarks they want to, and then we will have a panel discussion. First of all, Christopher Alexander, whom I know only slightly, has had an enormous critical influence on my life and work. And I think that's true of a whole generation of people. I think that for me, it began on the 2nd floor of the library of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard when I was looking for something else, and I ran across an essay by this person, Christopher Alexander, called, and it's been mentioned earlier, "The City is Not a Tree." That was a landmark moment in my development as a thinker and as an architect. It really blew away what were the foundational principles of the education at Harvard in those days. And it established in me an interest in actually looking at the world and not looking at a set of preconceived, abstract, mechanical ideas that were supposed to replace the existing world. It was, I would try to describe it, but the diagrams have described it better. But a city is not a tree. The easiest way to think of it is in transportation. Here's your house, little street. Think of it as a tree. You know, your house is the leaf at the end, and then the little branch comes down and meets the bigger branch and the bigger branch and the bigger branch, and finally you're on the interstate. And there's been no way to move laterally through that system. You can only come and collect in the trunk of the tree or the interstate. That was a planning principle that you'll see exemplified in the British New Towns after World War II and many other examples of modernist planning, this rationalized thing. Well, we'll have a community size enough for an elementary school, and then we'll have 5 of those, and they'll be big enough for a high school, and then we'll have 5 of those, and they'll be big enough for a downtown, blah, 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 blah. Chris, being a mathematician, used the term semi-lattice, and I've never understood at all what that means. Network, but a much more complex, with diagonal connections and lateral connections through the system, the way that people, in fact, really live. My next contact was a book called The Oregon Experiment, which again blew me away. And I remember talking to Oxford University Press about it, and they had no idea what they had. And I said, "You'll still be selling this book at the turn of the century." That was 9 years ago, the turn of the century now. The book came out sometime in the, I would think, the 1970s. And it posits the idea of growth by gradual accretion. That's certainly one of the many ideas that I took out of it. You don't master plan the world and build it. The world grows by accretions, and then each new accretion that you add to the existing fabric has something to relate to. I don't know whether they still use it as the planning guide at the University of Oregon. I was out there about 10, 12 years ago, and I was told they were still using it.
They do still.
As the guide. And then came what I think is Chris's masterpiece in the one book, if you read only one book. To read, it's a pattern language. I regret to inform you that it's longer than War and Peace. At 1100 and... I can't get to the end here. 1160 some pages. So you don't, but it's luckily not a narrative, so you don't have to begin at the beginning and read through to the end. You can dip in anywhere. This was, for me, I don't know how to describe it. Chris is someone that I would characterize as one of a trio, and the other two have been mentioned here often. Chris and Vincent Scully and Jane Jacobs all share the same quality, which is a distrust of the intellectual, abstract, Platonic idea of the world. They are people who go out and look and draw their conclusions and write them down and go home. They don't spend any time at all worrying about where they belong in the firmament of intellectual ideas and theories and movements in architecture, because they're not. All 3 of them act as if they'd never read a book, as if it all came out of their own observation. I assume that they have at some point read books, but they don't quote them. They quote themselves. I think this amounts to a movement, and that's why we've heard these names, and 3 of them now have won this prize. A different way of looking at the world, a way that I think is much more appropriate. And then finally, my last experience of Chris before I actually met him was a lecture he gave at Harvard on Persian and Turkish carpets. Not a topic that I thought I had any interest in at all. And again, I came away with an idea that had never occurred to me before, that has been rooted in my mind ever since, which is that in a large pattern, like the pattern of a carpet, it's made up of smaller patterns, each of which is complete in itself. Simple, simple idea. But when you see the examples of yes, it's done this way, and no, it's not done this way, you realize right away the logic of that. And then you can translate that into city planning. The city is a whole, but each part of it is a whole. It's similar to what Coleridge said about poetry, but I won't go into that. Visited him in his home, his country home in Sussex, I guess it is, south of London, a couple of years ago. And it's an interesting house, 2 Jaguars in the driveway. A painting of Queen Elizabeth I and of Henry VIII, each from life, and an extraordinary collection of paintings that Chris himself has done, and he never seems to advertise himself as a painter. But they were all over the place. They were obviously heavily influenced by Bonnard. That would be the sort of leading painter in his kind of portfolio. The richness of colors, the exaggerated kind of quality of light that you think of in Bonnard's work, and maybe a little of some others too. It was a house that was in the Doomsday Book, the list of houses in England that were made by William the Conqueror after 1066 and all that. And obviously it had been added to and changed over much time, but you had the sense of a person deeply rooted, not only in the place and the time, but in his own work, his own underpinnings of his own work. I was going to quote. What I did to prepare for this was leaf through a pattern language. I was going to quote something that by accident struck me, but I probably could have gone into it at 100 points and found something equally interesting. This is a pattern called Open Stairs. And he always begins with a picture. He always begins with an observation, something you can see. And then from that he deduces a premise, which in this case is about internal staircases being bad and external staircases that run up the outside of buildings being good. And then he always has a discussion of that. In effect, we are saying that a centralized entrance into a building that takes you to a corridor and stair in the traditional manner, the modernist manner, which funnels everyone in the building through it, has in its nature the trappings of control. This is the real Chris Alexander emerging here. While the pattern of many open stairs, leading off the public streets, direct to private doors, has in its nature the fact of independence, free comings and goings. We can see this most easily in the cases where the centralized door is without question a source of social control. Hates social control. In workplaces with a central entrance and a time clock, workers punch in and out, and they have to make excuses when they are leaving at a time that is not normal. In some kinds of student housing, people are asked to sign in and out, blah, 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 blah. And then at some place in here, I don't want to read it all, but he uses the word anarchism. And he's saying the kind of world that anybody can enter anywhere and anybody can see anybody anywhere, and it's all mixed up like that, is an anarchy, and he loves it. And I thought to myself as I was reading that the other day, now wait a minute, didn't he write books about order? Pattern? What do pattern and order have to do with anarchy? And that's the last point that I would try to leave with you. He is an absolutely anarchic person. He had a great deal of difficulty dealing, as many people did in Berkeley, with the administration of the University of California at Berkeley, and had many conflicts with them. A naturally anarchic person who is looking for a kind of order that will absorb and encompass anarchy, that an order within which anarchy can live. That's a big bill, but if I had to sum up what it seems to me he's been trying to do, that's what I would do. But I do recommend this absolutely wonderful book. You don't have to agree with it. I disagree with a lot of it, but there won't be a page on it that won't stimulate your thinking and make you wonder about something that you haven't thought about before. Having said that, I'll move on to Michael Mahaffey, and we'll have some kind of introductory remarks from each of these guys, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Go ahead.
I just want to say very briefly, because I've already spoken and I'd love to hear from these guys, but picking up on that point, Chris talks a lot about self-organization and about the way things organize spontaneously and what you need to sort of let that happen. I think that's been his passion all along, that he's very interested in just finding the ways to allow, for example, people to build by themselves, for themselves, things to happen in the way that they happen spontaneously, in this sort of bottom-up way, very, very close to Jane Jacobs in a lot of ways. One other point, very quickly, I was at I mentioned a symposium last week with 4 of the original 6 pattern language authors. It was really fascinating to hear their thinking about what went into the book, and this was very much the spirit of it. What was going on in Berkeley at that time in the 1960s and early 1970s, and what it took to sort of allow more spontaneous, sustainable kind of growth instead of the sort of rigid, top-down, mechanical stuff that was causing, obviously, so many problems at that time.
How find an order big enough and complex enough to absorb all those individual initiatives?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well said.
Liz.
You know, it's very interesting to think of remarks to make this evening, because Christopher Alexander has always been part of our professional and academic life in a way that he's just automatically there. And so I did the same as everyone else, most likely. Went back to the favorite books. And I was actually surprised to see that A Pattern Language came out in '77, because somehow I thought it was there before I even started being an architect in the earlier '70s. And the reason I think it seemed that way is that it's always felt that Christopher Alexander's presence has been in the background, supporting us, as he said himself in his own words, in our work. His writings really have been, his writings and lectures, a bulkhead for practice. For many of us, a kind of safe haven by his very thorough examination of how people use buildings and how one might design, incorporating that kind of analysis. That's the first part that I remember about his books. And this is, of course, at a time, which continues, when architects are expected to tell the user how to live in buildings of designs that never have heretofore existed, still being very much promoted in our profession. So he gave us the cover, in a sense. When I say us, I mean, of course, Andres and my practice and the new urbanists as a whole, the courage to buck the dominant professional and academic trends, the inclination to focus beyond the individual building on placemaking that might, in fact, please its users, a kind of radical idea. His scholarship, and after all, the words in the prize mention scholarship and criticism, the description of it, and I thought that Chris's scholarship, in fact, has been his criticism by his proposals implicating and critiquing contemporary practice. So I first understood the reach of his work in the 80s when a Princeton professor of Latin spoke to me about a pattern language, and I was very surprised to see that someone else in a completely different field had such a great admiration for it. And then more recently, at a Congress for the New Urbanism, this one in Austin, where he received the Athena Medal, Alexander's keynote speech brought developers in the audience to tears. It was quite surprising. It was a wonderful talk.
Developers cry?
Yes.
Hard to believe.
And it was, I really didn't understand it, but they were reacting to his articulation of their purpose, which included, I might add, even comments and advice about writing contracts. But much in the way you've heard described this evening, his ability to speak to history, fact, and the very deep emotions in taking actions, he was calling forth the kinds of reasons for which people make themselves developers, but in fact can never speak about in public, apparently. So this span from Latin scholar to developer reflects, of course, Alexander's own range in his publications. So I don't want to take a lot of time. You can tell I'm editing as I'm going through the notes I made. But I might read just a few quotes. It is shown that towns and buildings will not be able to come alive unless they are made by all the people in society, and unless these people have a common pattern language within which to make these buildings, and unless this common pattern language is alive itself. These fragments are very difficult to put out there because, of course, you keep reading and there's much more in there. But I think one of the things that we might comment on is how collaborative his work is. And so even though we are honoring him, if I think of the counterpart to those early publications, it was 5 Architects, in which this whole idea of star-architecture was born. And even though he is the individual we are honoring tonight, and indeed the driver of all that work and the initiator, he's always been very careful to, even all the photographs showed lots of people working together on these things. So let me stop here and pass it on to Vitold.
Vitold.
I don't know if do I need this? No, it works. Good. Well, when I was invited to come, I was very pleased because when I thought about it a little bit, I realized what a long history I'd had with this gentleman. A vicarious history because I was a reader like probably most of you. And it started very early. In 1964, I was a 21-year-old student, and a friend of mine and I had founded a magazine at McGill where I was studying architecture, and I found an old copy, and we had an article by Christopher Alexander and B.B. Doshi, who was is an Indian architect, and it was about planning villages, how villages should be planned in India and how they should be laid out, and there were sketches. I think we reprinted the article from somewhere, and I have no idea how we got in touch with him or how we got the article. But he was clearly somebody that, for young architects, students, was saying things that we were interested in hearing. And the following year, we had to do a thesis in our final year. And a friend of mine had dug up this Fortran program that Alexander had written, where you took the lattice or semi-lattice or whatever it was, and you broke it down into rules, and then you ran stacks of little cards with holes punched in them through the computer, and it forced you to think about what the project was. And I remember I looked it up this morning. There were 45 statements that I had, and they were all interrelated. The thing didn't run at all. I later found out, and that's, I think, the only thing I resent against Christopher Alexander was that it actually never ran anywhere. And we had spent months with these horrible cards with the holes in them, trying to get them to run. On the other hand, it did make us think. It made me think about how can you break a project down into requirements, is what he called them. Rooms should face a certain direction, or there should be wind protection, or whatever the thing was. And like everybody, I think, of my generation, I bought those books. I think I bought them because I was a Catholic boy, and they look like missiles. And I think they're supposed to look like missiles. They have those. They don't have a paper jacket. They're just. And I don't think they had a ribbon, but they should have. And I went on and did other things, and it all came back to me when I was building my own house. And my wife and I built our house. I didn't design it, I built it. And I realized at one point, I think it was because I had placed a window somewhere, and I realized you couldn't see anything through that window, and it really should be a little bit lower and a little bit over here, and then you had a nice view out. And somehow the patterns started falling into place. And I think it's impossible to design a house using the pattern language. It would be a horrible, sort of like doing a crossword puzzle. But all the patterns were actually there. They sort of came out naturally. And even the one about sleeping facing a certain direction, that was the way our bed sort of turned out. And it was the thing that I think convinced me totally, that experience of the correctness, the sort of fundamental correctness of his vision. And as I told Bob, I was totally convinced, but this was in the 80s, and I very quickly realized that I couldn't actually talk to people about it Because by then, Christopher Alexander had made so many enemies that if you raised his name in polite conversation, people say, "Oh no, not that person. You can't be serious about that." So I had to sort of keep quiet about it and just have it for myself. And as a final comment, like Bob, I went back to the books. The books will always be there, I'm convinced, and the books are what it's about, really. Not for Christopher Alexander. I think for him the buildings are important, but for me the books are what it's about. And I didn't want to carry that heavy book, so I took one of the thin books on the train to read. But I also wanted to mention it because it's not one of the famous books. It's not as well known as Pattern Language, and it's a new theory of urban design, which is a preposterous title, as Alexander himself admits. And it's a wonderful book, and it's wonderful, I think, like all his good books, you hear the voice of the man when you read it, and it's a kind of sane voice. I love the anarchy analogy because I think that's true too. But the books are kind of sane. He's looking at things. He's definitely a teacher. He's teaching you things. And those books are just a wonderful kind of connection that you feel you have with this person. They are, of course, theoretical, but they're written in a way which is very much alive.
Maybe you shouldn't tell Chris that there ought to be ribbons in the books and make them more religious looking. I had several questions. We only have about 15 minutes, and we were told we would not have time to go to the audience, so if you've saved up a question, I'm sorry.
Corner us afterwards.
Come up to us afterwards, indeed. A couple of questions, and it's what Vitold was beginning to raise, and any one of you may want to answer this. What is the presence of Christopher Alexander and his work in American schools of architecture, and why?
Non-existent. William Saunders wrote the review of a pattern language in Harvard Design magazine.
No, the book about order.
Well, both, actually. He wrote Nature of Order also, but before that he wrote a review of pattern language, a very late review of pattern language, and he said, it may very well be the most read treatise of architecture of all time. And then the next sentence was, but among the schools of architecture I know, it's as if it didn't exist. And I spoke earlier about all the other disciplines, and Liz mentioned also all the other disciplines taken this up and done really interesting things with it. And I think, I guess there have always been a little bit of two cultures within architecture, and Chris has sort of certainly not endeared himself to the one culture that seems to be holding the day. And I think that's essentially what's happened, is that he is largely ignored within the architecture community and yet celebrated within the software and other communities.
It's very interesting. Liz, you are the dean of the School of Architecture.
Well, yes, and you would find his books in our school. But I think it's always an individual decision about whether students can dive into it and actually penetrate it at the age that they are starting to think about all of these things and the profession. They're not quite ready to have somebody telling them absolutely everything about what they don't know anything about.
Sure.
And so I think it's actually developed taste. But I do think that internationally there is a very broad impact and continuing influence through the readings. And I dare say that in every school of architecture you'll find a few people who are brave enough and thoughtful enough to take it on early. And then I dare say that others in the course of their life begin to take it on in the course of their professional life as they feel ready.
I would add two comments to that. One is, it's very interesting. I've had students that tried to take a pattern language and use it as a means, a book of rules of how to get to a building, and it doesn't work. And I think, I don't know if Chris would agree with me, he probably wouldn't, but I think he is a magnificent observer of life and a drawer of conclusions about life. He is not a system maker, it seems to me. And he would like to be, and he would like that book to teach you how to go step by step by step by step, go from pattern 87 to 42 to 128, and you'll have a great building at the end of it. It doesn't work. The other comment I would make is American schools of architecture are in universities, and universities have philosophy departments, and the architecture faculty begins to get envious and think they ought to be intellectual too. and they tend to fall in love with abstract theories, especially if they are originally written in French and German. And in fact, architecture is not primarily, and I emphasize the word primarily, an intellectual activity. It's a social and physical and spatial and a lot of other kinds of activity, but not primarily an activity of ideas. Okay, let me try another question.
Could I just add something? Because
sure.
It struck me when I was thinking about it today that Alexander was one of the first architects who talked about theory. And he was a pioneer in that sense because, in fact, theory has overcome architecture. It's just not his theory. It's the German, French, Latino theory of obscurationism, I think, mostly. So it's kind of, it's poignant that this man who brought theory to architecture has lived to see theory, in fact, succeed, but it's in a very different way. And it's not his theory. It's really this very...
His theory is not an abstraction that is distant from the world of place and space and time. That's the difference, I think.
It's phenomenology, not post-structuralism, to go to the philosophy schools here. He really is about, in the Jane Jacobs sense, confronting the actual things. And he's very wary of building big systems. I mean, he tries to, but he always sort of breaks it down at the end and tries to make sure that the system doesn't seize us, that we can use the system and it won't use us.
Liz, were you going to add something? I want to try one other question. Again, I'm asking questions about the aspects of Chris that I know least about, and this is the one I know least about. He has built 300 buildings. He is a licensed general contractor. What about these buildings? Are they good? Are they bad? Why aren't they better known? Why aren't they published more in the magazines? And anyone, Vito, do you want to try that?
I've always thought that the weakest part of his theory was the absence of culture. Culture is very important. He's from Northern California. That's important. He has a background, a European background. That's important. And I think you can fit his work into... I was thinking of Carl Larson when I was looking at many of these slides.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
You could... Arts and crafts. I mean, it's in a category. It isn't sui generis. And I think it would need to be judged in that way. And I'm not sure people are that interested in Carl Larson anymore.
Mm-hmm.
He's done his thing, and he had a huge influence.
But they have been published, and they are global. I mean, they're all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I think when you look at them closely, you will find that they are individually of their place. You can distinguish the places that they're in. But I've always thought they were interesting because of the way they were made, which was always collaboratively and by hand, and that, in a sense, whether you could critique them formally and say, this proportion is wrong, or why isn't he looking at the way capitals and bases of columns are made, and everything, all the ways that people might look at those buildings. That, in fact, they're about embodying the ideas and the numbers, the observations that are in his writing. And in a sense, I think the fact that he uses all three tools, words, numbers, and images in his work so integrally with his own being is one of the things that makes him unique, because most architects will deal with the images only, and many of us have trouble speaking and writing. We can draw. Other people have great strengths in describing the ideas verbally or in writing. And then there are a few who deal with the numbers and try to set out the systems. But he's really doing them, all of that, all of the time, and trying to show that it all goes together.
And doing his paintings, on which he spends years on a single painting. He told me that he scrapes it off and tries again and scrapes it off and tries again.
Just a quick addition to that. The buildings have always been sort of the way he has developed his ideas. He's never developed them in abstraction. He's always been out building stuff and trying to figure things out. So in a way, his buildings are somewhat experimental for that reason, but also very sort of specific to the group of people that he's collaborating with, and not the kind of thing that somebody publishing glossy magazines would necessarily find very interesting, perhaps, unless they're connected to the
Yeah,
ideas.
you definitely get the feeling that they're not about, this is a Christopher Alexander building, and therefore you have to get every last detail absolutely
Right,
correct.
right.
Interesting. Would a fair criticism of his buildings, which I haven't seen only pictures of, that they are sometimes too literally illustrations of his pattern ideas?
I wouldn't say so.
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I did find, having seen that show one right after the other, how many times it reminded me of Leo Creer, the work of Leo Creer, which is who's also a writer and a drawer, a painter, and has built. And there's something about those forms that I started thinking about the interrelationship between those two practices, theories.
Too much concrete, though. Leo doesn't like concrete.
Not so much concrete.
Two other topics came up just showing how diverse this person is. By the way, I was going to say, he's writing a book about a school that he designed in Japan that was built. And the publisher sent me the first couple of chapters to be a kind of early reader and all. And that seemed very interesting to me. So I thought I would ask you before we leave the built work, if I had all the money and time in the world, what should I go see?
Certainly the Japan school, the Asian school.
Any other thoughts? No particular favorites? Okay.
California, there's a number of projects. You saw in the show the garden, the farmers market in Fresno, and the homeless shelter in San Jose, and of course now in Portland there's a new project coming out of the ground with some really interesting ideas about patterns. It's a town center on the light rail line in a suburb of Portland, with using pattern languages in a kind of different way. Very interesting. So that'll take a while to go.
You ought to organize a tour, I think, so that we can all catch on. I'm not of the generation that knows how to turn on a computer, and I'm fascinated by what you just began to touch on, the influence of Chris Alexander on the world of digital computers and all the rest of it. Could you say a little bit more about that and draw that connection a little tighter?
Well, as I mentioned, we were with Ward Cunningham, who's probably one of the key people who saw the value of this in the world of architecture and saw how it was useful in the world of computers, which seems completely counterintuitive.
It does,
How could that be? And yet, the logic of it was exactly the same. They had the same kinds of problems of, not so much space to arrange, but collaborative problems to solve, and something about the logic of that made complete sense to Ward and to Kent Beck, his colleague, and they developed a whole new approach to software design called design patterns, which is hugely influential. And
what is it, though? Can you say what
it is? Essentially a structure of pattern languages. If you go back to notes on the synthesis of form, the kind of logic of problem solving and the way configurations. What's interesting is that problems keep recurring, but not just as individual problems, as sort of clusters of problems. You keep having the same sort of set of clusters of problems, and you can start to identify those as almost like subroutines, if you know anything about computing, or ways that you can solve the same problem over and over as it keeps recurring over and over. But each time it's got to be a little bit varied, and that's what the software people have to do. Just as architects can take a typology and use that over and over again, but in each case it can be very different.
The term user-friendly comes to mind. At the same time that you're solving problems, that you're imagining how someone else will be dealing with the construct.
Yeah.
I'd love to know more about it. I'd love to see a demonstration sometime of somebody using a computer language that is derived in some way from the pattern language.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's the way these systems work. It's similar to our brains. I mean, you touched on that earlier, that this is the way we think, and this is the way we solve problems, and that's why our brains work that way. And that's why I think actually an earlier generation of software people who were doing object-oriented software were inspired by Chris's early work on notes on the synthesis of form, because it really is sort of the essence of problem solving in the simplest way.
Just one last topic. Again, it came up and we touched on it, just showing how broad this person is. There seem to be a limitless number of topics you can bring up. Sustainability, climate change, issues of that kind. Someone want to comment on Chris's early influence, if there was such, on that?
Well, you know, I think in summary, actually, not so much just the early stuff was always about being organic, responding to daylight.
And local materials, local traditions, things of that kind.
Following the culture and so on. But if you think about it, his idea that you make places that people appreciate, that people love, might be the formula for the ultimate sustainability, in which you make places that people, in participating in making and in their beauty, will want to save and never take apart. So that embodied energy of the first Building Act remains for a long time.
That's very true, isn't it?
There's this notion that you know, you save buildings. Again, I touched on this topic of technology, the notion that we're going to create new technologies, whether it's you know, solar power or whatever. That's not necessarily going to solve the challenge unless we deal with these kinds of you know, deeper connections between, I mentioned sustainability and beauty, sustainability and lovability.
Even as early as the pattern language, he talks about issues of density of population and things like that that are being talked about all the time now. And he talks about them as creating the need for social cohesion in a genuine community sense. But they are also, of course, issues of sustainability and use of resources. We're at, can't believe it, already at 8 o'clock. Let's have a round of sort of whatever I've left out in the way of questions. Any comments you'd like to make?
While they're thinking, I just want to add, I do hope that Chris will come and speak again, because I just touched on it earlier that he actually, in the last couple of days, has been sort of feverishly coming up with yet another idea, this notion that Randy talked about of configurations and archetypes, which I'm very intrigued, and I hope you are too, and I hope he'll come back to the National Building Museum when he's feeling better and tell us more about that.
I hope so. I didn't mean to just throw the medicine ball at you that way.
I don't know if Nat Glazer is here, because he told me he was going to be here. There he is.
I'm sorry, who?
Nat Glazer was
Nat
Jane
Glazer.
Jacobs' editor on Death and Life of American Cities, and I was doing some research on Jane Jacobs. And this is to your comment about anarchy. And one of Alexander's colleagues at at Berkeley had, I guess accused is the right word, Jane Jacobs of being an early neoconservative. And I asked Nat about that, and he said he thought neoconservative wasn't the right word. But he said anarchist would be a better word. And I think Bob's absolutely right. There's a sense in which both of them see the world as very, very messy. And they see the charm in that, and they're, on the one hand, looking for order, but also, at the same time, very worried that too much order will lose the thing that you actually value. And I think that is a theme that runs through both of their works. And I think those beautiful hand-painted decorations that he slops on do that. They really make the building unprecious and really quite wonderful. And but I like your comment about that, because I think that does bring them together. And it's important to remember that, particularly with Jane Jacobs, because there's a tendency to see her as another kind of planner. And I don't think she was another kind of planner. She didn't like planning. She believed in the market. She believed in individuals. And
she, shortly before her death, she got together with Ken Greenberg, the planner in Toronto, and they persuaded the city to establish a neighborhood that would not have any use zoning. All uses would be permitted. So this is not the kind of planning that is, you know, there were dimensional zoning, you know, certain heights, certain setbacks, whatever, but no use zoning. I don't know how that's worked out. I would love to see it.
Well, that's Andres has proposed that for New Orleans, opt-out zones for rebuilding.
Opt-out zones?
self-building in a way that allows people, because this is what was so great about New Orleans. There was so much self-building there.
Well, and since we're speaking about coding and codes, it might be pointed out that going back to a pattern language points out how much the new urbanists work on design codes, including form-based codes, which is a recent word, but the content of those codes owes a great debt to Christopher Alexander. And, you know, maybe we could end, since he is seeing this film, with on a note of gratefulness and thanks for his contribution to all the work that so many of us are engaged in, both here present tonight and really all over the country and indeed all over the world.
And the work continues.
Yes.
I think we all are terribly, terribly grateful for the experiences that he's provided. Thanks very much.